Welcome to Comic-Con 2016, and this panel, which should be called Spotlight on Paul Levitz. We have a different title now. There are so many ways to approach the career of Paul Levitz, who of course began as a super fan and fanzine publisher, as a writer of terrific stories that we all remember, creator of some cool characters like Huntress. And of course, lately has been a comics scholar and enlightener of comics history, comics historian, for doing some terrific books on the history of DC Comics, and of course, recently a critical biography of Will Eisner. But for this panel, we want to focus on a period of Paul's career that went from the late 70s until recently, until the 2010. In his role in leadership at DC Comics, taking the company from almost sort of a prehistoric moment when it was transitioning through the growing stages of comics as pop culture and comics as literature to the moment that we're in. And Paul had not only a front row seat but the driver's seat for a lot of that. So we're going to talk about, throughout Paul's career, how he managed to unlock the creativity of so many great talents within the framework of comics publishing industry and a company in particular that was known as being fairly conservative and not taking too many chances, and the amazing work that came out in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s as he was doing it. So,
thank you, sir. Thank you all.
So let's begin at the beginning. What is the secret? What is the secret origin of Paul Levitz? Who are you, and how did you come to this? And how did you come into this crazy business, I guess?
Secret origin. I think my mother took some courses with Frederick Wortham when she was at Brooklyn College. So God must have said, if you listen to him, you deserve somebody who will show you that it isn't true.
Right.
That's probably the most secret part of the origin. I was one of the generation of New York comic fans coming of age in the late 60s and the early 70s, when the first generation creators of comics were to some extent aging out of the business. Comics had been at that point a closed shop for really a very long time. Each company had its own dynamic, but there weren't more than perhaps 200 creative people producing all the comics in America. 90-95% of them living around the New York metro area, a small cluster in Los Angeles. You had to come to the offices to deliver your work, stand there worshipfully while your editor made either brilliant or meaningless comments on it. And it had been a really lousy business to be in as a creative person for a very long time. But the Depression era guys who had started it were grateful that they were able to be in a business where they could do what they loved. Not comics, but writing or drawing. Very, very, very few of them viewed themselves as comics people. And they were starting to age out. Few of them had managed to go on to other sorts of good careers, but most of them had just had it. And the vast majority of us who were the small group of kids who liked comics and were fanzines and putting on the first comic conventions or other sorts of activities, got a chance to do something in business, either to be an assistant editor, to write some stories, to be a production artist, whatever entry-level kind of thing we paid incredibly badly. Many of the kids didn't stay very long because they went on to do other real jobs. Some didn't stay long because they really didn't have a particular talent or gift for it. A few of us said, it's okay, we can do this for a few years till we get a real job. Hopefully the comic book business won't be dead by then. In my case, I was using it to pay for my schooling. I was going a couple of days a week to NYU studying business. I figured I'd get a real job selling technology or was a bit of a science buff. So it was a space that was starting to exist between computers that were as large as this room that could do less than the cell phone you've got in your pocket. And the public was really an interesting world. So I was going to get my bachelor's and master's degree in business and go do something useful in that world. But meanwhile, a couple of days up in DC, we paid for it. It was a blessing.
So when was that? When did you start there, and what was the atmosphere of the company like in the first days when you were doing your earliest work?
Well, I began hanging around in comic book companies in '71 when I started publishing fanzines. I did sort of the early 3D guide for the field. I started freelancing for DC in late '72 and started on the staff the day after I finished high school, summer of '73. From a masthead as an assistant editor at 16 years old, which is a record that will probably stand because I think we have labor laws against it. I think they had labor laws against it. I didn't notice. I didn't ask them for it long, really. I was filling in for the summer for Joe Orlando's assistant, a man named Michael Fleischer, who was also a comic book writer. And Michael decided not to come back to the assistant editor's job. I didn't kill him, I didn't bribe him, went off to do many wonderful things with his life and career. And I just never left.
Probably a good idea to not say bad things about Michael Fleischer.
His stories of the period were fairly interestingly violent, but did some noble work later in his career. So that's another very long story. The other half of your question, the atmosphere of the companies. The older guys universally believed that the comic book business was about to be dead. The newsstands, which were the only distribution methodology for comics in many decades, were fading in their efficacy. It was unclear, and there was never any really effective marketing studies done. What proportion was the effect of television giving kids ultimate means of entertainment, and what was the sheer failure of the distribution system to match where the population was going. But the best analysis I've ever been able to do with the information I had access to indicated it was much more a distribution problem than a purchase choice problem. We were losing our retail points of sale. But the guys they had given up. It's like, this isn't going to be here. So the young writers were sitting there saying, I'll do 2 years of this and then I'll go write TV, or I'll do 2 years of this and then I'll write my novel. I'll do something. And the old guys were saying, please God, let it last until my pension kicks in.
So around, I guess, 1976, a new face appeared in the DC Corridors. Was that the year? Talk a little bit about who that was and what that transition was and what it meant for the business.
I'll start off with the fact that this had been a very insular business for a very long time. The vast majority of the comic book companies that had existed in America from the beginnings of the Golden Age onward were entrepreneurially started and family-owned for many, many years thereafter. DC and Marvel had both sold to corporations in the late 1960s, but family members were still present for the next couple of years, either at the companies themselves or parent corporations in positions of authority. In the 70s, for the first time, you had the two big houses rudderless in the sense of there being no entrepreneur who had grown into being a business leader and no trained professional business person running either company. Western Publishing, which was a very significant force in those years, was a more traditional corporation, had more traditional leadership. Harvey and Archie were still being run by the founding families and were literally shriveling as you watched because of that. Warren was a very small entrepreneurial company. That's basically the comic business in the mid-1970s. There's not much of anything else in America. Warner Communications, which is DC's parent company, was frustrated by the poor sales that comics were exhibiting, frustrated by some of the business problems the company individually had and its leadership had, and it decided to let go Carmine Infantino, who was a brilliant artist who had risen to be a good art director, a good editorial director, and a really challenged publisher. The business side of the company was not something he was particularly trained for, or, in my view, particularly naturally adept at. And he had no wind in his back as the business environment really sucked. From the parent company's point of view, this was a children's publishing business. So they looked for someone who knew something about children's publishing. Kind of nice if they knew something about the comics work. That was really secondary. Really need someone who will work cheap. This is not an important business. You know, we're not going to hire a search firm. And they were aware socially of a woman named Jeanette Kahn, who had created 2 successful children's magazines, something called Dynamite for Scholastic, which was around for many, many years as a success, and a knockoff of Dynamite called Smash, which she created for Xerox after she had problems in her deal with Scholastic. And Jeanette was 28 years old, a woman. We didn't have women in comics. We didn't have 28-year-old women in comics. We didn't have women in positions of authority in comics. And a very, very cultured, very intelligent woman who had lived in worlds that the traditional comic book people had not. She was a Radcliffe graduate. She had hung out with Andy Warhol's crowd. She had done her internship at the Museum of Modern Art in the photography collection with her fine arts degree. She was not a Martian, but that was about the only thing she wasn't that made her a natural for the company. And she descended like in a puff of smoke as the publisher and essentially co-chief executive officer of the company. And looks at this and says, comics are wonderful. My older brother used to ask me this. I really liked reading Batman comics. These were cool. And then she starts looking around and says, is this the 18th century or the 17th century? And couldn't we do something about that? And started to try to fix things.
Well, as we all know, comics did not cover themselves in glory in the way that they treated creators and the way that they approached creative rights from the earliest days of the business, partly because they were founded by these sort of very hardscrabble entrepreneurs and things like that. So you say Jeanette came in and she took a look at this. What were some of the changes in approach to creators that began to happen in these days, and were you part of those conversations about trying to change that dynamic?
You know, the starting point of comics, part of it was the entrepreneurs, but part of it was the creators themselves. These were very ill-educated, unsophisticated people breaking into the field. They had no resources. There were no lawyers interested in this field. There were no agents. There was no expectation that anyone was creating anything of value. There were 1 or 2 creators along the way. Jerry Siegel really outstandingly believed in his property and thought he was creating something the world might care about. But almost all of the people who created the early comics were business amateurs. Of the first generation, Joe Simon was a reasonable businessman. Will Eisner was a good businessman. Joe Kubert was a reasonable businessman. I don't know that I can come up with a 4th. Now, I didn't know everybody. I knew those guys, and I knew many of their peers, and I know the deals sung by many others. William Moulton Marston, who created Wonder Woman, was a businessman, but he wasn't a comics guy. He was a professional from another world coming into comics. and his deals reflected it. When we look back with our modern standards, and we look at how the deals were done and how the talent were treated, it's very, very easy to say, this was wrong. It's kind of like looking back on some of the practices of the founding fathers. Should Jefferson have known better? Yeah, Jefferson was smart enough, he should have known better. But it's very hard to judge his practices in his personal life by contemporary modern standards. This was a highly consensual, unfortunate situation. And if comics had been as unsuccessful as everybody expected them to be, it really wouldn't have mattered and everybody would have had a nice time. But the fact was, some of this work that was created ended up having enormous enduring value. And even by the mid-1970s, when Jeanette arrived, there were very few cases where enduring value had been created where the creators had not participated. But there were a few. And it was enough that certainly many of the young people in the field looked on Siegel and Schuster as the original sin of the business and said, okay, we're not doing that. The truth was we didn't really understand what Siegel and Schuster's deals had been. We didn't understand the money that had changed hands. It was this kind of very simplistic, it was $130 and they got Superman, and I'm not doing something that stupid. So we had gotten to a point in comics that I like to describe as being the old Russian Federation, the USSR joke. They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. The publishers were paying very modest wages for the work, and the creative people were unwilling to create new supporting characters, introduce new elements. I'll just tell with the old villains. I'll retread the old stories. And when Jeanette arrived, and she saw that situation, she began to look at ways she could fix it and improve it. And she created the first deal at DC, where it was kind of a standing deal that if you created a new supporting character, you could get a percentage of the licensing and merchandising that might arrive from it. Over the next 5 or 6 years, a group of us, Jeanette, Joe Orlando, myself, Dick Giordano eventually coming on board as a staffer and executive of the company, were able to develop the first written contracts for talent in the business that were used uniformly. These were not Hollywood contracts with, your own dressing room and your name above the title, but said, you'll get credit for your work. You'll get paid if you deliver it. Your art will get returned to you. Art was being returned up until at that point, but it wasn't guaranteed to you to be returned. It started to say what the obligations of the parties were. These are the rights you're giving the company. This is the reward you're getting for it. This is how it will work. And we began to improve those as we could along the way within the economics of what was still a horrible, horrible business. And finally, at the end of 1980, we were able to come up with the first royalty plan to apply across a major comic book company. To say, if we make money, you'll make money. Again, this wasn't radical by publishing standards, but it was radical for the comic book business. It also was interesting in the comic book business to just figure out how to divvy this up. The 4 of us at that point, Dick had come on board, were sitting there in discussions of, well, we don't pay writers as much as we pay artists because it takes artists longer to draw than it takes writers to write. So shouldn't the artist get more of the royalties than the writer? And Joe, who was steeped in the practices of EC and Mad Magazine, where he came from, and was an artist, firmly believed, no, the writer had to receive half of the royalties in the process, because they're a full and equal contributor. Does the inker matter as much? At that point, we were dealing with very simple coloring systems. Many of the inkers in the business were tracers, just rendering things to be able to be reproduced. Some were incredibly brilliant and talented people. Wally Wood was still inking at that point, Joe Sinnott over in Marvel, Dick Giordano. And Dick was cheerfully sitting there as an inker saying, no, I don't think the inkers deserve as much. I think it's, it's just a skill. It's not, this isn't real art. And I'm sitting there as a writer who can't draw anything other than a schnauzer head saying, you guys spend all this time on this stuff, and you can make things happen that I can't imagine. And all of this back and forth is going on as we ultimately worked out what the first splits would be. Those aren't exactly the splits that exist in comics today. The changes in coloring dramatically changed the weight, and it took most of the companies a long time to cut the color just insufficiently. We had a hard time figuring out how to do that economically as that transition was going on. But a lot of the logic that went into those first contracts, that went into those first royalty plans, still stand as industry sort of baselines of how things have grown. I'm extraordinarily proud of the role I played in those things.
So that these innovations benefited the creators, of course, but they also benefited the fans, because starting in the mid-1980s, we really started seeing an explosion of new creative juice, particularly out of DC. Some of the biggest projects that we remember from the mid-80s, Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. I would put Howard Chaykin's Shadow series up there. There's a bunch of really cool and edgy projects that DC handed over to artists with a unique vision at that time. Can you talk a little bit about that? And was that considered a risk? Was that considered a kind of an edgy move at the time? Or
well, there's a set of things that come together at that point in time as a business. I firmly believe that royalties were critical to it, and not just DC. When we did it, it took Marvel, I think, under 60 or 90 days to put a royalty plan in place to match it, which was much more costly for them than it was for us because their sales were so much higher than ours were. So we were rewarding people a little bit for current success, but mostly setting up a formula that if you can make the business better, you will share in it. Marvel was put in a position of having to share a great deal of their present success with their talent, and they stood up and did it. Some of the smaller presses were doing royalty plans before that, were starting to do more sophisticated ones. The combination of all of that aligned the interests of the creators with the publishers in a way that had not been the case. And that kind of relationship was critical, I believe, to the creative flowering that we saw happen in the expansion years. Creators fought to stay on the good books, fought to get on the good books, had motivation to continue pouring energy into them, to keep making them grow, making them better, had motivation to take chances. And whether that was the projects you mentioned, or Jim Starlin doing the Death of Captain Marvel, one of Marvel's first album editions, if the company won, the talent won. At the same time, you had the growth of the comic shop, which began to be a more and more important part of the field. And by about 1984 or 1985, crossed over to being the larger part of the business, and clearly the growing part as the newsstand was fading. Well, the customers who were coming into the comic shop were older, they were more sophisticated, they were very interested in who the talent producing the book was, what the physical format of the book was, so we could afford to print the book a little better, charge a little more for it, pay the talent a little more, charge a little more for it, color separate a little better, charge a little more for it. And this was a good, healthy bargain for all concerned. And all of this began to affect it. So the courage came in leaps. Something like Ronin, which was taking Frank Miller, who had done really exciting work on Marvel's Daredevil monthly, but it was largely conventional comics just being done very well, badly color separated, badly printed, distributed to the newsstand under the comics code, and saying, Frank, come here to DC, talk to us about how you'd like your work produced. well, I like this paper I've seen on French albums. Could we print something on this? I like this blue line color that's never been used by conventional American comic publishers that will allow a full-scale range. And really involving him in all the physical processes, the business processes, working out a unique contract. At that point, it was the first book at DC that the talent had the copyright. We didn't give him the trademark. Didn't revert to him under certain circumstances. Did it matter? Did it not matter? And this was very much an evolutionary process. Everything was new. Everybody was trying to find the right set of answers. Extremely exciting. And at the same time, we were trying to figure out how to take the comic shops. 500, 700, really badly financed, small mom and pop kinds of enterprises, and turn that into a system that could actually reach the country in distribution, and then offer an opportunity for people to come in and see these wonderful things. So it was a wonderful multi-level business problem and creative problem that all fed together. And we envisioned some of what exists now. We didn't envision that you could sell out the 150,000 people here in 2 minutes flat. But we knew comics were good for many other flavors of creativity besides what we were producing. We didn't know which of them could find an audience. We knew that if creators had a fair stake in the material, and you can always argue to death exactly what point is fair, but no stake is not. Unless the talent has chosen to take all the cash up front in some outrageous fashion. That's a stake too, it's just not a continuing stake.
By the late 80s, DC was not only expanding under its own auspices under the DC brand, but we started seeing some incredibly innovative new talent coming from England and the UK in the form of Neil Gaiman and Grant Morrison and later Warren Ellis and people like that. And you also had the first African-American independently produced superhero comics in Milestone being distributed and published by DC at that time. Talk about, I guess, some of the things that took place at that time to expand to sort of spread the wings of the DC brand, to introduce a more diverse range of content and to an expanding audience, and what were the successes and failures there?
Well, you start out with courage. You start out with a belief in the medium you're working in. And as a team, we believed that comics were wonderful and that people would like comics. Our tastes in the material were very, very different. But we weren't just interested in producing what we liked, which was really one of the critical decisions. We weren't really interested in just producing what we knew we had an audience for. This was a company whose lifeblood was founded on a property that 13 publishers, including DC, had rejected, that nobody could possibly care about it, and that then proceeded to pay our rent for decades and decades thereafter. That should have had a sensibility in the company's genes throughout to say, you've got to experiment, you've got to take chances. By the late 80s, a couple of things were going on. One was we had begun to experiment with the idea of imprints, which, again, this is not radical, but in the publishing industry, you often say, I want to do something a little different, I want to brand it a little bit, let me give it an individual name. And we started to build off the editorial work of Karen Berger, who had grown into a brilliant editor, with a taste and style of her own, and say, all right, let's brand this as Vertigo. Let's have our Vertigo rates be a little bit different. More of a writer's company than an artist company. We'll pay the writers a little bit more. We'll cheap out a little bit on the art. we'll spend a little more money on the covers. Vertigo cover is going to be a little more like paperbacks. We're going to be painted. We'll spend more money on those than we spend on the superhero covers. We'll change the contracts a little bit to be more favorable over time. We also, at that point, were doing what may be the stuff that is my most lasting work in the field, which was the beginning of the evolution of the form of the graphic novel. One of the things that was a personal mission to me in comics, from when I came in as a fan, was the fact that you couldn't get the old stuff, the good stuff. You could go buy a smelly back issue for way more than a sane person should pay for it, that had survived in somebody's garage in a box of comics. But if you went into a bookstore and you liked mystery stories, you could get John Grisham or you could get Agatha Christie. If you liked music and you went into a record store, you could get Mozart and you could get the Beatles. Beatles wasn't the new thing at that time, but I'm not a music guy, so what the hell do I? But if you went to a comic shop, you could only get that day's thing. And I put a lot of energy into trying to find answers to that business problem. The first couple of efforts, one effort to license it out in album formats, failed miserably. Didn't fit the racks of the few comic shops that existed. There weren't enough comic shops to support it. The second, doing it in rack-size comics that we would hopefully reprint every few years. Didn't really do anything much. But when we had the success with Dark Knight, we went out, we figured out the trade paperback format, and we also did a really groundbreaking deal with Warner Books, which was a sister company, to get it significantly distributed into bookstores. That was the first time in America that a graphic novel of current comics material was published. There was a long history of various formats of paperback reprints of little good origins of Marvel Comics. We put all the origins together with Superman from the 30s to the 70s. But this was, no, this is this year's stuff together in one book, and it's going to be like a book. If you actually like it and care about it, we're going to keep this in print as long as anybody keeps caring about it. And I'm incredibly proud that we're here 30 years later, and with the exception of a handful of weeks when demand outstripped supply or our systems failed, that book's been in print ever since.
Your distribution on the Dark Knight book was so good that I bought my copy at the Tower Records at 3rd and Broadway. They had it right in the rack up front.
We did a lot of work with Tower.
So I have a lot more questions, but I see that this room has steadily filled up with Paul's expanding fan base. So let me take a few questions from the crowd if you guys have questions. Before we do though, I realized I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Rob Salkowitz. I'm author of Comic-Con and the Business of Pop Culture, and I write for Forbes. And the reason that we're talking about this business stuff, in addition to Paul being a maven on it, is I think it's a really important area that it unlocks the creativity behind the stuff that we love, to know a little bit about how the sausage is made. And so we have the opportunity to talk to somebody like Paul, who's at the front lines of this, in a place like Comic-Con. It's an opportunity that we shouldn't miss.
Yeah, let me just follow up on that for 1 second, and please get to your questions. It's the nature of all of us as readers passionate about what we enjoy, to love the content and care about the content. That's what matters. It's very hard to get passionate about a deal. But the truth is that our media forms are affected by the deals and the technology. The yellow kit exists because printing started to allow color printing. The daily comic strip exists because Hearst and Pulitzer realized that they could get people to come back every day to buy the newspaper that way. So many of the things that have happened that have made comics a good place have happened because the business and technological developments have empowered them to happen. That takes nothing away from the brilliant creator who takes the possibility and makes it into something. But both need to exist for things to thrive.
Questions? You, sir, in back.
Is a very minor part of success as a writer or an artist. It's useful because you're going to have to chase some checks coming in. Knowing how to negotiate a deal is less important for a writer and artist in the business today when there are lawyers who are familiar with it, who are practicing in comics, or agents. But it still helps. Business teaches you a lot that's useful. The strategic logic of business, having a strategy for your career, branding yourself as a writer, is more important today in all forms of writing than it, I believe, ever has been, and will be only more important in the next few years. So if you've got a choice of one of those to study, I'd study marketing. And I don't mean in that you have to go get an MBA in marketing to be a professional writer, but pick up a good couple of marketing and branding textbooks and look at it. Know enough to hire a good accountant, know enough to hire a lawyer who actually has worked on comics before, worked on intellectual property, and if you don't know one, call somebody. The most amazing thing to me is the number of people who don't ask the questions of me or other people. I'm getting into this. I'm doing my first deal in this field. Who can I work with? It's not all I get nearly often enough. And maybe that's because I'm a grumpy old bastard. But I should get it every now and then.
You had said, you had named, I think, 3 business minds in comics, and you said you
First
had
generation.
first generation. And you had a hard time thinking of a 4th one. And I don't know that I would classify this as a business mind, but I wonder if you would talk about Bob Kane's deal of retaining his rights to Batman.
I can't talk about the details of Bob's deal, but I can guarantee that Bob was not a businessman. But Bob and his heirs have made an awful lot of money from Batman, which is wonderful. Many of the creators who you think did not make a lot of money from their properties made a lot more money than you think they did. There's a lot of mythology around some for the good and a lot of mythology around some for the bad. Most of it is mythology.
I was talking with Scott Shaw, the cartoonist, yesterday at his table, and he said that he remembers getting a call from you, Paul, asking if you had any information on Mike Sekowsky's widow. Mike Sekowsky, of course, the artist who did all of those great Justice League and Supergirl and Wonder Woman and things like that. And that he said, sure, I have her number right here. And the next thing he knows that she said, they just got $10,000 from DC for back stuff, and she could have knocked her over with a feather. Not even the guys that were not great creators seem to benefit in some ways from their.
Well, again, that goes back to what I'm saying. If you create a system where you treat people decently, you create an expectation that people will be treated decently, then everybody doesn't have to be totally paranoid about whether their I is dotted or whether they've audited you every 3rd day. You start understanding you're on the same side. Listen, I don't remember the story you're recounting, but I grew up loving Mike Sekowsky's Justice League. I can't imagine how delighted I must have been to find an ability to send that money. I had great days like that. I remember literally one day answering the phone. The switchboard had somehow managed to get it to me. Hi, you don't know who my father was, but I'm John Fort's daughter, I think it was, and he worked for DC, And, I was just wondering, if there's any money he's entitled to or anything. And I said, yes, I grew up on his Legion of Superheroes. I love those comics as a child. It's a delight to meet you. Not one of the industry's great artists, but one of the comfort foods of my childhood. None of this was nobility. This is somewhere between basic decency as a company, and many of us were committed to that. And good, sound business, because the next person is going to say, all right, maybe I can trust these bastards.
Even enlightened self-interest is in rather short supply sometimes these days. So it's, whatever the motivations behind it, I think it's better to foster trust by doing well by doing good. Probably gets you farther in the long run. We had other questions?
So it occurs to me that you came in right as you said, there's this transition from mom and pop, family-owned businesses to corporate entities. And you mentioned that you were going part-time to NYU for business school. The great thing I think you brought to the industry is A, the fans mindset from before, and B, really sound business skills, right? I think you really try to transform it into
I hate the business skills, maybe.
Yeah. But did you ever finish your degree?
I did not. I dropped out to go full-time. I'd done about 3 years of a 5-year bachelor-master's program. But again, continuing that sort of general through line, at the time DC was, when Jeanette became president of DC after about 5 years there, and she wanted to make a lot of this happen, we had a good relationship. She had some confidence in my innate business skills, if not my learned business skills. And the company wasn't about to pay enough to hire somebody who actually knew what the fuck they were doing anyway. So again, I had the extraordinary good fortune that I probably had the most amount of business knowledge you could possibly have for the very small amount of money they were willing to pay for the chief, what was essentially the chief operating officer of the company. And I had the ridiculous luck of being 24 years old and being the number 2 of the company, a division of Warner Communications, presenting the company's annual budget at budget meetings to a legendary guy like Steve Ross. What the hell was I doing in that room? But thank you for your appreciation of my skills.
One of the accomplishments toward the latter part of your career is in the early 2000s, DC became the publisher of the Will Eisner Library, both the Spirit Archives and the graphic novels. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about and how, as somebody that was a sort of a fan and a friend and a scholar of Will's work, going into business with him and seeing him on the other side of the table?
Well, Kitchen Sink had gone through several transformations, but had ended up with a series of outside shareholders. And it was a tough time in comics, as happens every few years, and the company was going under. Bob Wayne and I were down at Diamond for some meetings, and we spent a dinner that evening debating whether or not the Spirit work that Kitchen had been in the process of reprinting would benefit more by being the DC Archives format or the kind of Russ Cochran EC format. And we felt good about our ability to do justice to it in the archive format. Talked to Dennis, talked to Judy Hansen, who were representing Will. And we were able to bring it over to DC. It was an interesting negotiation with Will because it's an unusual body of work and an unusual format. We were proposing to do something that would reprint in, I think it was 24, 25 volumes over 7 or 8 years. How to solve all the business problems of that. And it was interesting to negotiate with.
So that's I have heard some stories that indicates that's true. So we have just a little bit of time remaining. I have one more question, and then I would like to give you some time to talk about your current projects and your what else you're doing at the convention here. The last question is basically, any regrets, either things that you wish you had done differently or things that you didn't get to that you wish you could have?
Oh, shit, yeah. Mark Evanier had a wonderful line at one point, quote about me in something, where it was saying I was basically, I don't always agree with Paul's decisions, but he's a really nice guy. Mark's a dear old friend. I don't always agree with my decisions. You know, you, as a business leader, you make a lot of decisions. You make most of them on highly imperfect information with a very tight amount of time. I made some bad ones. I don't think I made a lot of horrendous ones that damaged the industry terribly. A few of my peers at some of the sister companies, we can line up with a little headstone of how many comic shops they killed or how many creators they drove out of the business. I don't think I have too many of those. But there are creative talents I wish I had had the skill to keep working with us and didn't. I wish I had found a way to make the Milestone books work. I think they're some of the best books that we published that didn't succeed. And I don't know whether that was the coloring method the guys picked or the inability to connect with the right audience for them. You know, there are specific moments and specific relationships with individual creators or individual deals that I regret. Batting average, I'm well content. We did a lot of really great work and accomplished a lot. I had an old joke many years ago that I wanted as my professional headstone, honest publisher, because it's an oxymoron. And I feel like I've gotten that from the field. I'm very grateful for that.
Excellent. So finally, what are you up to these days? What are your current projects, and where else will you be appearing at this convention?
Trick question. Well, my current project, I spend about half my time teaching. Writing at Manhattanville. Pace has a master's in publishing course. I teach the publishing of graphic novels, and I teach transmedia and the future of publishing. We talk a lot about the branding of authors in that. Columbia lets me teach the American graphic novel, or co-teach it about every 2 years. That's their usual cycle for electives. Keeps threatening to let me do something else once in a while. My buddy from Columbia, Karen Green, smiling in the front row here. This fall, I'm happy to be teaching comics, graphic novels, and the American Jew at Princeton. That should be a hoop. That's about half my time. I serve on the board of Boom, one of the mid-sized publishers in the field, and try and help them work out good creator deals, help them work out a floor plan for moving their offices about a month ago, because that's something I did about 4,000 times in DC, and I'm, I guess, relatively good at that. It's one of my bizarre skills. Write for DC. I've been doing Dr. Fate, which I've been having a ball with Sonny Liu, who's a brilliant, talented artist. Write Brooklyn Blood for Dark Horse Presents. I'll probably write some more comics for somebody, not sure who next. Write Odd Little Things, there's a piece on Green Arrow and Aquaman in the convention program book that you've got. Nice paragraph on Murphy Anderson, who's a dear friend, in the in memoriam. Do occasional consulting gigs for people on various strange subjects, media companies. Still on the payroll of DC's parent company, Warner Brothers, to occasionally help them with some old problem. And whatever sort of comes across that's amusing. I'm a comics guy. Oh, and for those of you who have gotten hernias from thinking about getting my 75 Years of DC book, I'm happy to announce that Taschen is going to be reissuing it next year, end of this year, beginning of next year, in a smaller size at about $70. And that should be really cool. And that actually you can bring to a comic convention without a forklift if you want to do something.
Just maybe the book that you're talking about may be the physically largest thing ever produced about the comic industry. It's actually twice the size of Paul himself. So anyway, and then you have a couple more panels coming up. You're going to be doing
Yeah,
an Eastern panel or something like that?
We have a panel on the British invasion.
Oh, right,
Which
yes.
you're mentioning, which is tomorrow at 12 in room 29. And I'm moderating a panel on a series of wonderful books that are nominated for the Eisner Award this year, including my own Will Eisner Champion of Graphic Novel. But there's a book on Charles Schultz, a book on Jules Feiffer, a book on Harvey Kurtzman, and many of us who worked on those are going to be in this very room at 10 o'clock on Saturday, talking about the whole process of sort of writing about the history of comics. And then I'm on a panel in the academic conference that has something to do with Batman in the classroom. And I don't quite understand what it is and what I'm talking about, but as a faux professor, I'm kind of just glad to be invited to be in the room with those guys and not get laughed out of the room.
Great, and then terrific.
And I have signings at the DC booth, and if you check in there and you can check the schedule, or if you go to paullevitz.com, actually all of this schedule is up on there. I don't post a lot of stuff there, but every now and then I post some things.
Great. So one last plug from the moderator, if you are interested in these kind of issues about the business of comics and diversity in publishing, I'll be on a panel at 5 today on diversity in nerd journalism. And then tomorrow, very excited to do a panel called Pop Culture Shark Tank, 1 to 2 over in room 3132. Join me, please, in thanking Paul Levitz for a terrific panel.
Thank you all for being here. I know this isn't one of the hot draw panels, so I appreciate your carving the time.